The first tour I had was a regimental operations officer at the same time. Chris was out there. He was out in al-Assad, out in the western part, dealing with the Wild West, and we were in we had the Fallujah area and the entire surrounding area. And it was right at we were just talking before we started here, and the pre-deployment site survey that we went on was 10 years ago last December. And we went out there to take a look at what was going on, because both of us were going to inherit the areas that we'd go into. And it was right as the fighting was going on. The fighting was kind of wrapping up in Fallujah for the second battle. And one of the things we were trying to figure out was, what do we do? What do we do now? How do we keep the insurgents coming back in? How do we get life back to some semblance of normal for the people of Fallujah? And for that entire year, we worked at it. And unfortunately, one of the things we didn't have was an Iraqi partner.
I think a lot of people don't appreciate fully. Once the city was taken in late 2004, the Marine units there imposed a number of physical security measures to control access to the city. So for instance, around the city itself was a series of checkpoints and berms were created, as well as concertina wire and concrete barriers to physically limit the access of people to the city. So you had to enter the city through 4 or 5 checkpoints. Every house had been gone through more than once. Every Fallujah resident had an ID card. He or she had had their photo taken, their retina scanned, probably fingerprinting, a variety of population control measures. And even with all of those measures, and you had Marines sitting at combat observation posts at different points in the city, keeping an eye on main roads, troublesome neighborhoods, things of this nature. Even with all of these measures, there was still a low-level insurgency constantly bubbling. And our forces, of course, could win, and won every engagement they had, but there wasn't that game changer. Sort of violence was at a steady state. So when I arrived in April of '07, my job was kind of one of these weird jobs that pops up occasionally in counterinsurgency. I was initially attached to the SEAL Team 7 and 10 to do some other kind of work, but they had this tribal outreach effort. General Mullen had mentioned the nationalist insurgents and the Islamist or al-Qaeda affiliated insurgents. Essentially, when he and I arrived in 2007, we started to see this split between both forces. There were a variety of factors that contributed to that, one of which, frankly, was that al-Qaeda had overreached. They were brutalizing the population. Another factor, which many commentators don't often consider, is that the Democratic Party had won the U.S. Congress in 2006. And from an Iraqi standpoint, it's like this was a rejection of President Bush's party, that maybe the Americans aren't going to be here forever. And and the Iraq War factored, among many factors, contributed to that electoral result. So there was a sense that maybe the Americans aren't going to be here forever, so who's going to be in charge? And the nationalists are like, well, we're going to be in charge. Al-Qaeda's like, well, we're going to be in charge. They actually unveiled a shadow government with different cabinet agencies. Here's how we're going to do things. These two factors, and also the fact that for many tribes, they have a lucrative business of smuggling goods across the border from Syria and Jordan and other places. Al-Qaeda was starting to bite into that. There's a variety of things that contributed to this split. So in late 2006, mid-2006, you start to see this, what's called the Anbar Awakening. And it was a series of sort of tribes that said, look, we're tired of the brutality, we're tired of your, frankly, cutting into our smuggling, our corruption, and we don't agree with your vision for the future. And so they started to partner with us. And there had been an attempt to do this earlier in the war, but a mixture of sort of our not knowing Iraqi culture, not recognizing certain opportunities and other things didn't cause that to come to fruition. But by '06, we had a real good sense of it. And it started, most people tend to think it started in the city of Ramadi, the provincial capital, but there's a view that kind of started on the border with Syria near a town called Al-Qaim. There was a tribe there called the Abu Mahal tribe. It's a series of small tribes there. And this is sort of generally seen as kind of the place it began. So these tribes would volunteer their sons, typically, for local security forces. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. But essentially, when I arrived there in 2007, we had a brand new mayor had arrived in Fallujah. We had a brand new police chief, which General Mullen will probably talk about. And we had a new commander of the Iraqi army. So we had a whole new leadership change on the Iraqi side. And we had a brand new reconstituted city council that was less than a few weeks old when I got there. So it was sort of things were starting to change on a larger scale. They hadn't changed yet in Fallujah, and there were some new opportunities.
The nationalist insurgents, they saw the fact that we were leaving, but they also saw the fact that over the course of years, the military forces, the U.S. military forces have been very professional in our approach to things, how we went about doing things. We were measured in our response. There were some mistakes out there, there's no two ways about it. We're human beings. But for the most part, we've been very, very professional. And we had to overcome 30 years of Saddam Hussein telling them, you know, what boogeymen the Americans were. And it happened fairly quickly because they saw the rabid dogs as the Islamists were, and they saw us, and they said, you know what, we're done with those guys. And and they actually told us this in conversations you'd have with them. So that was pretty profound. And I think and I think we'll end up talking about this later, but it also gives me hope for what's going on out there now, because the ISIS folks, I don't think they're really in charge of very much out there. And they've also started killing Sunni tribesmen, and you just don't do that. And I think at some point it's going to turn on them, and when it does, they're going to evaporate. Ramadi had always been a very tough place, and all of a sudden it was getting pretty quiet out there. So I sent my battalion XO out and I said, hey, figure out what's going on. What did they do that's different? Because we were having the same sort of issues in Fallujah. And he came back and we put a plan together, and we called it Operation Aljah, A-L-L-J-A-H. We formed precincts. We have maps of it in the book. We formed precincts. We secured those precincts. We hired auxiliaries that we called Neighborhood Watch. We paid them a small stipend so that they had at least something jingling in their pocket. It wasn't enough to survive on. And we told them, look, if you do well with this, the police may hire you. And we did not arm them. We gave them uniforms, and Dan will talk about that. He got a big kick out of our first attempt to provide them a uniform. And then they worked for the police. And we set up a joint security station in each one of the precincts that had Marines, Iraqi soldiers, and these neighborhood watch personnel. Because the dynamic then was those neighborhood watch personnel who knew who belonged and who didn't. And insurgents can't operate in that environment. And things started getting very quiet as we moved from sector to sector throughout the city. And there was still some fighting going on, mortar attacks, sniper attacks, but by the end of the deployment, when we had the entire city locked down, what was the final number? I think
less than 80 by October.
Less than 80 security incidents in the city by the end of October. They've got, I forget what the latest estimates were, thousands and thousands of Westerners going to fight the Great Jihad. And all the Western countries now are very worried, how are we going to get control and make sure we're tracking who actually went over there for when they decide to come back and cause trouble at home. And they're from all the countries to include our own. And they're also, you have the bandwagon effect, again, as I mentioned earlier, is the Iraqis, when they see a winning team, they want to be on the winning team. They want to jump up and down in front of the cameras. They want to be part of that. And when ISIS first rolled into town, that's what they wanted, because they, when we were there, they referred to the central government as Iranians. They couldn't stand them, and it only went downhill from there. We were able to get to the point where, like, look, just work with them through the political process.
Not all the tribes were part of the Anbar Awakening. Some were nominally with it. Some were just really hostile to it. It's a mixed bag of tribes. I think also this is what I would call an alliance of convenience. There are Sunni groups that saw ISIS coming into their country as a useful tool to pressure Maliki on the short term to maybe leave office, and the long term possibly to have changes in policies or constitutional structures. I think, for example, General Mullen and I have talked about this. We don't necessarily think that Fallujah fell to ISIS last year. It was more kind of like, well, we'll turn the other way, or somewhat invited in. Once the calculations are made by the Sunni Arabs that this is no longer in their interest, I think you're going to see it change. But that political strategy hasn't really been put together. There's some things that have been done on the margins. We're doing some things, some efforts, but the political rationale is not there yet, I think, for the Sunni Arabs to turn against al-Qaeda and ISIS.
You watch things that are going on in Iraq, things that same kind of dynamic was going on in Afghanistan. You get some members of the military that really all they want to do is kill people and break things. That's what the military does well. That's what we want to focus on. We don't want to do anything else. It's almost like they want to put a sign up that says break glass only in the case of war we want to actually fight. And instead of what we get, we don't have a choice. We have to figure it out. And as a matter of fact, Dan and I were talking about General Westmoreland when we were driving in, and it seemed to us that what he was doing in Vietnam was he was trying to fight the kind of war he wanted to fight, and was trying to make a square peg fit in a round hole. Well, we still have people doing that in the military. The Army's in the midst of an enormous argument amongst themselves about counterinsurgency. They want to just throw it out the window. A lot of them do. They want to get back to combined arms skills, fighting the big war. And I've actually gotten in arguments with some because, like, well, you know, in the last 30 years, only one person's been stupid enough to stand toe-to-toe with us in the desert, and he actually did it twice and got beat badly both times. Everybody saw that. There's no surprise. You know, why would you want to do something like that? It's like an NFL football team getting ready to play, and the opposing team wants to play soccer in the parking lot. And you know what? They win because they score the goals. And we're sitting there wondering, well, how'd that happen? So it's very frustrating. And one of the things that we're trying to do, I have an organization underneath one of the divisions that works for me, is a small war center. And we're trying to make sure we don't forget the lessons learned, and we're trying to make sure people understand whatever the country decides we're going to do, we don't get a choice in the matter. That's what we're going to do. What I have faith in the fact is the average Sunni Iraqi, while deeply religious, they see these folks as being just as crazy as we do, and they don't want them there. Right now, I don't think they have any choice in the matter. Because, you know, they come in with the black flags and all, you know, all the heavy weapons, and they put their flags up, and people are kind of like, okay, let's just kind of go about our life and try and keep from getting shot or get our head cut off. But when things turn, again, I think it's going to turn fast because they don't want them there. Don't tell them they can't smoke cigarettes. That doesn't work. Don't tell them they, you mess with their corruption, their smuggling, because I mean that's their livelihood out there. They don't want it, and so I have faith in the fact that, you know, they're going to kick them out. And then it becomes our problem all over the world when a lot of these folks, the foreigners who have become radicalized, go home. And what then? I think we may have seen some of that in Paris.